The envelope arrived on a silver tray. Not the heavy cream stationery that had been delivered to every other guest at Ashford Manor that week. The kind stamped with the Duke's seal in midnight blue wax, the kind that smelled faintly of cedar and importance. No, what was placed outside Edith Calloway's door that Tuesday morning was a folded square of paper, thin as a whisper, its edges slightly smudged, as though someone had handled it without much care. She picked it up herself. The housemaid had already gone. She unfolded it slowly, standing in the doorway of the smallest guest room in the east wing, the room they had given her, the one with the warped window that let in the cold and a view of nothing but the kitchen garden. She read the paper once. Then she read it again. Roasted turnip soup, barley bread, boiled carrots with salt, stewed pork common cut. The servant's menu. For the banquet. The grandest banquet Ashford Manor had hosted in 11 years. Edith stood very still for a moment. Outside, a cart rolled across the gravel drive. Somewhere below, a woman laughed, high and bright and careless. Lady Priscilla, most likely, already making herself at home in a house that was not yet hers. Edith folded the paper carefully. She smoothed each crease with her thumb. Then she tucked it into the inside of her glove against her palm where she would feel it all day. And she smiled. It was a quiet smile. The kind that does not reach the eyes because it does not need to. The kind that knows something the room does not. The Duke of Ashford had no idea what he had just done. The invitation had come 3 weeks earlier, and it had not come from the Duke. It had come from a solicitor, a small, precise man named Mr. Gerald Finch, who had traveled all the way from London to deliver it in person, which Edith had thought was either very serious or very strange. It turned out to be both. She had been living quietly in Bath at the time, in 2 modest rooms above a bookshop on Milsom Street, surviving on the small income left to her by her mother and the careful management of every single penny of it. Her father, Baron Calloway, had died the previous winter, leaving behind a title worth less than the paper it was printed on, and debts that had eaten through the family estate like fire through dry grass. Edith had not mourned him loudly. She was not the kind of woman who did anything loudly. Mr. Finch had sat across from her at her narrow table, his hat in his lap, and told her that the late Duke of Ashford, his Grace Edmund Vane, who had passed 6 months prior, had named her in his will. Edith had set down her teacup very carefully. Named her. Not as an afterthought, not as a charitable gesture, as a principal beneficiary. She had asked Mr. Finch to repeat himself, which he did, patiently, without expression. He was a man who had learned long ago not to react to the reactions of others. The details were these. The late Duke had left Edith a formal interest in the Ashford commercial holdings in London, the warehouse leases along the Thames, the shipping contracts, the import licenses that had quietly made the Vane family one of the wealthiest in England for the past 40 years. It was not a gift. It was a transfer of legal ownership, drawn up with meticulous care, witnessed and signed, and entirely, maddeningly unbreakable. The condition was simple. She was required to attend the royal banquet at Ashford Manor on the 14th of November, where the formal documents would be presented before witnesses. If she did not appear, the holding reverted to the estate. Mr. Finch had slid a second envelope across the table. Your formal invitation, Miss Calloway, as a guest of honor. She had arrived at Ashford Manor 4 days ago. The new Duke, Richard Vane, the late Duke's nephew, 29 years old and freshly inherited, had not greeted her himself. He had sent his secretary, a thin young man with nervous hands who had shown her to the East Wing room without apology or explanation, as though the warped window and the view of the kitchen garden were perfectly natural accommodations for a woman who had been named in a duke's will. She had not complained. She had simply taken note. In the days that followed, she had watched. That was something Edith was very good at, watching. She watched Richard Vane move through his manor with the particular confidence of a man who had never once considered that a room might contain someone more important than himself. He was handsome in an ungenerous way, all sharp jaw and cold eyes, and he wore his new title like a man still getting used to the weight of a coat that had been made for someone else. She watched Lady Priscilla Holt move through the same rooms like a woman who had already measured them for curtains. She was beautiful, Priscilla, nobody could deny that, and she knew exactly how to use it. She had taken one look at Edith on the first evening and smiled the specific smile that beautiful women sometimes give to women they have decided are not worth worrying about. Edith had smiled back, pleasantly, patiently. She watched Lord Harwick, older, white-haired, with eyes that missed nothing, watch her in return from across every room they shared. He had known the late Duke well. She could see it in the way he held himself, like a man carrying a weight he had agreed to carry and would not put down until the right moment. They had not spoken yet, but they would, and she watched the Duke. She watched him at dinner the first night, when he had glanced at her across the long table and then looked away so quickly it was almost rude. She watched him the following afternoon when she had come into the library, and he had barely acknowledged her presence, turning pages in a ledger with the kind of focused disinterest that takes some effort to perform. She watched him at breakfast, at tea, in the corridors, and she saw, very clearly, what he thought of her. Nothing. He thought nothing of her. She was a minor inconvenience with a questionable claim and an unfashionable dress, and whatever his late uncle had been thinking, Richard Vane clearly intended to manage it swiftly and cleanly and without sentiment. And then the envelope had arrived, on its thin, smudged paper, with its turnip soup and its barley bread. She understood the message perfectly. It required no translation. You are not a guest here. You are a problem, and I would prefer you to know your place before the important people arrive. Edith pressed her palm against the folded paper inside her glove and walked downstairs to breakfast. Richard Vane was already at the table, reading correspondence, a cup of coffee at his elbow. Lady Priscilla sat across from him, feeding small pieces of toast to a spaniel that had no business being in the dining room. Neither of them looked up when Edith entered. She took a seat, not the seat nearest the door, which was clearly the seat they expected her to take, but the one 3 places down, where the morning light came through the window at a pleasant angle. She poured her own tea. She selected her toast. She buttered it with complete composure. After a moment, Richard Vane looked up from his correspondence. He looked at her, at the seat she had chosen, back at her. She met his eyes with an expression of perfect, polite serenity. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said. He said nothing for a moment, then Miss Calloway, and went back to his correspondence. Edith drank her tea. Outside the window, 2 groundsmen were carrying flower arrangements toward the main entrance, enormous things, white roses and trailing ivy, fit for a royal occasion. The banquet was 4 days away. She pressed her palm against her glove. Turnip soup, she thought. How interesting. And smiled into her cup where no one could see it. The morning of the banquet, Ashford Manor woke up early and did not stop moving. By 7 o'clock, the kitchen was already producing sounds that traveled through the walls, the heavy clang of copper pots, the rhythmic thud of bread being worked, voices calling instructions over the noise of something being rolled across a stone floor. By 8, florists had taken over the entrance hall entirely. Their crates of white roses and hothouse lilies stacked against the marble walls, while 2 young women on ladders threaded ivy through the chandelier chains, with the focused expressions of people who understood that perfection was expected, and tardiness was not forgiven. Edith watched all of this from the top of the main staircase, her coffee in her hand, still in her morning dress. She had slept well. This surprised no one more than herself. She had expected to lie awake, turning things over, rehearsing. But there was something almost restful about having waited this long. 3 weeks of traveling, 4 days of being looked through as though she were a piece of furniture that had been placed in the wrong room, and now, finally, the day itself. She felt the particular calm of a woman who has already decided what she is going to do and is simply waiting for the moment to arrive. She pressed her palm to her glove out of habit now. The folded paper was still there. By midday, the guest list had begun to arrive. They came in carriages, some modest, some extravagant, all of them sweeping up the gravel drive with that particular theatrical timing that people of consequence tend to develop without realizing it. Edith watched from the window of the small sitting room at the end of the East Wing corridor, the one nobody had thought to tell her she wasn't supposed to use. She recognized some of them. Lord and Lady Fenwick, who had known her mother slightly long ago before everything. Old Sir Thomas Croft, who had been at her father's club and had looked straight through her at 3 separate social occasions in Bath without any sign of recognition. A young viscount she didn't know, tall and laughing, already at ease in a way that only money from birth can produce. And then a carriage that was different from the others. No family crest on the door, but the horses were exceptional, the driver in a uniform she didn't recognize, and the footman who jumped down to open the door moved with the precise efficiency of someone in royal service. Edith leaned slightly forward. The woman who stepped out was perhaps 60, upright as a column, dressed in deep burgundy with a traveling cape that had clearly been made by someone who took their work seriously. She paused at the bottom of the manor steps and looked up at the building with the calm, assessing gaze of a person who has seen many impressive things and is not easily added to. Edith recognized her. Countess Marlowe, the Lord Chamberlain's personal representative, the woman the palace sent when it wanted to observe something without appearing to observe it. She had met her once before, briefly, years ago, in circumstances she had never told anyone about. The Countess had been a friend of her mother's, not a close friend, but the particular kind of friendship between women who respect each other's intelligence and ask no unnecessary questions. Edith set down her coffee cup. She went to dress. The banquet hall looked extraordinary. Whatever else Richard Vane might be, he had not cut corners. The long table seated 40, laid in white linen and candlelight, the Ashford silver polished to a mirror finish, crystal glasses catching the flames and throwing small pieces of light across the ceiling. White roses everywhere on the table, in the alcoves, banked along the window ledges in long arrangements that smelled like the inside of a greenhouse on a warm afternoon. Edith stood in the doorway for a moment and simply looked at it. Then she found her place card. She walked the length of the table slowly, reading names as she went. Lord and Lady Fenwick, center, excellent position. Sir Thomas Croft, left of center, respectable. The young Viscount near the top, closer to the Duke's end. Countess Marlowe, second from the head of the table on the Duke's right. Lady Priscilla, first from the head on his left. She kept walking. Past the midpoint, past the lower third, all the way to the end of the table, where the room narrowed slightly toward the serving corridor, and where the smell of the kitchen came through the wall in warm, starchy waves turnip soup. She noted, with a composure that cost her something, and where a small card had been placed at the very last seat, nearest the door through which the footmen would be moving all evening with their platters and their trolleys. Miss E. Calloway. She stood there for a moment. From this end of the table, the head where Richard Vane would sit, where Countess Marlowe would sit, where the candlelight was richest and the flowers were tallest, seemed very far away. It was, she estimated, approximately the distance between being seen and not existing. She picked up her place card, held it between 2 fingers, set it back down. Then she went to find her seat, sat down, and arranged her skirts as though she had chosen to be there herself. The room filled slowly, the way grand rooms do, with a kind of gravitational confidence, each arrival finding their position in the constellation of the evening, voices rising gradually to fill the space above the candlelight. Edith watched the door. Richard entered with Lady Priscilla on his arm, which told her the engagement announcement might be coming tonight, a detail she filed away without particular feeling. He looked the part. He always looked the part. The dark coat, the easy authority, the way he moved through a room as though it had been built specifically to contain him. Priscilla beside him was luminous in ivory silk, and she knew it, and used it, touching his arm at precisely the moments most likely to be observed. They moved to the head of the table. Richard's eyes traveled down the length of it, quickly, efficiently, the way a man checks that everything is in order, and for one brief moment his gaze reached the far end, reached Edith and moved on. Moved on. Edith folded her hands in her lap and said nothing. The room continued to settle. Soup was brought. Conversations began. The Viscount said something that made the women near him laugh. Sir Thomas Croft told a story that had almost certainly been told before. The candles burned steadily in the still air. At the head of the table, Richard was speaking to Lady Priscilla in the low, private tone of a man who thinks he knows exactly how the evening will go. And then the door opened one final time. Countess Marlowe entered without announcement. She was not the kind of woman who needed one, and the room did what rooms always do when someone of genuine consequence walks into them. It shifted. Not loudly. Just a slight, instinctive rearrangement of attention, like sunflowers adjusting to where the light is. The Countess paused inside the doorway. She looked at the table, and then, with the unhurried certainty of a woman who has never once had to search for what she was looking for, she looked directly at Edith and walked toward her. The length of the table, the entire length of it, past Lord Fenwick and Sir Thomas Croft and the Viscount and 20 other people who all watched with expressions of increasing confusion, past Lady Priscilla, whose smile had gone very still, past Richard Vane, who had stopped speaking entirely. She stopped at the last seat, at Edith's seat, and she took both of Edith's hands in hers. "Miss Calloway," she said, warm and clear and perfectly audible, "my dear, I have been so looking forward to meeting you." The room was very quiet. Edith rose gracefully and returned the greeting with the composure of a woman who had been expecting this, because she had known, from the moment she saw that carriage in the drive, that the evening was about to change direction entirely. "Countess Marlowe," she said, "how kind of you to come." The Countess did not release her hands immediately. She held them a moment longer as though making a point of it. Then she turned just slightly and looked at the head of the table, where Richard Vane sat absolutely still, his wine glass halfway to his mouth, his expression that of a man whose evening has just rearranged itself around him without his permission. The Countess spoke to him pleasantly, across 40 feet of candle-lit silence. "Your Grace, do you know," she said, "who this woman is?" Richard Vane set down his glass. He did not answer. The question hung in the air above the banquet table like smoke. 40 people heard it. 40 people watched Richard Vane's face in the candlelight, some with curiosity, some with the barely concealed hunger of those who attend grand dinners precisely for moments like this one. Lady Priscilla's fingers had closed around the stem of her wine glass with a pressure that had nothing to do with thirst. Lord Harwick, 3 seats from the head of the table, had gone very still in the particular way of a man who has been waiting for a specific moment and has just heard it arrive. Richard recovered quickly. He was good at that, the rapid reassembly of composure, the smooth return to surface. He set his glass down, straightened slightly, and produced a smile that was entirely convincing if you didn't look at his eyes. "Of course," he said, "Miss Calloway is a guest of the estate." The Countess looked at him for a moment without expression. "Yes," she said pleasantly, "she is." And then she turned back to Edith and said, in a tone that managed to be both intimate and completely audible, "You must come and sit near me. We have a great deal to discuss." There was a silence in the room, not long, not dramatic, just the brief pause of a collective breath being held and then released. And then Lord Harwick was on his feet, moving his place card 2 seats down without being asked, creating a space to the Countesses left with the efficiency of a man who had been anticipating exactly this rearrangement. Edith picked up her own place card. She looked at it once Miss E. Calloway in the Duke's secretary's careful hand, and set it down on the empty seat beside Countess Marlowe. She settled into the chair, arranged her skirts, and accepted a glass of wine from a footman who had appeared at her elbow with considerably more attentiveness than any servant in this house had shown her in 4 days. From this end of the table, everything looked different. She could see Richard Vane's face clearly. He was watching her, not the quick, dismissive glance of the previous days. This was different. This was the focused, recalibrating attention of a man who has just discovered that the board he has been playing on is not the board he thought it was. She could see him thinking, could see the precise moment when the question he most needed answered, "Who is she exactly, and what did my uncle do?" became the only question in the room that mattered to him. Lady Priscilla leaned toward him and said something quietly. He didn't turn to look at her. Edith lifted her wine glass and looked at something else entirely. The dinner continued with the particular determined elegance of events that have lurched off their intended course and are being steered back by sheer collective willpower. Courses came and went. The conversation redistributed itself around the table in new configurations. The Viscount found Countess Marlowe considerably more interesting than he had expected. Lord Fenwick told his wife something behind his hand that made her look at Edith with an expression of rapid reassessment. At the head of the table, Richard Vane ate without tasting anything. Edith knew this because she watched him, carefully, briefly, between her own conversations with the Countess, who turned out to be exactly as sharp and warm and quietly formidable as her mother had always said. They spoke of London, of the shipping licenses, of the particular challenges of managing inherited complexity, which was the Countess's very elegant way of referring to everything that had happened to Edith in the past 2 years, without making her feel pitied for any of it. "Your mother was extraordinary," the Countess said at one point, low enough for only Edith to hear. Edmund Vane knew it before anyone else did. That was always his gift, knowing what something was worth before the rest of the world caught up. Edith looked at her plate for a moment. "He was very kind to her," she said, "and to me." "He was deliberate," the Countess said. "There is a difference. Kindness is instinct. What Edmund did for you was architecture." Edith thought about the will, about Mr. Finch and his nervous hands and the envelope across the narrow table in Bath, about the years before that, her mother working quietly, invisibly in the late Duke's London offices, managing figures that would have made most men's hands shake, while the rest of the world looked at her and saw only a baron's unremarkable wife. Architecture. Yes, that was exactly the right word. "He knew I would come," Edith said. "He knew you would come and that you would not make a scene," the Countess replied. "He trusted your restraint. I confess I find it slightly miraculous, given what they put in your envelope this morning." Edith looked at her sharply. The Countess's expression was perfectly composed. "I arrived last night," she said simply. "The housekeeper talks to her sister who talks to mine. It is a very old system and it has never once failed me." A pause. "He doesn't know yet," Edith said. "It was not quite a question." "No," said the Countess. "Lord Harwick will tell him tonight, after dinner. I imagine it will be an illuminating conversation." She reached for her wine with the serenity of a woman watching a play she has already read the ending of. "I would not wander too far from the library after the dessert course, if I were you," she added. "Things tend to move quickly once Harwick decides the moment has come." The moment came between the cheese course and the port. Edith saw it happen, saw Harwick rise from his seat, saw him lean down to say something brief and quiet near Richard's ear, saw the Duke's expression shift in a way that had nothing to do with anything Priscilla was saying to him. He set his napkin on the table. He excused himself without explanation. Harwick followed. Lady Priscilla watched them go with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and then turned to the Viscount, and said something charming and brittle that made him laugh without knowing why. Edith waited 3 minutes. Then she excused herself quietly and walked to the corridor. The library was at the end of the west wing, past the portrait gallery, through a door that was not quite fully closed. She did not go in. She stood in the corridor, close enough to hear, not close enough to be seen, and she told herself this was not eavesdropping so much as being present for a conversation that was, in every meaningful sense, about her. Harwick's voice first. Low and measured, the voice of a man delivering information he has organized carefully and intends to convey without drama. Her mother was Margaret Calloway. She came to Edmund in 1809, initially to assist with correspondence. Within 2 years she was managing the Thames contracts entirely. Edmund trusted no one else with the import licenses, no one. Not his solicitors, not his steward, not his own brother. Margaret understood the business the way very few people do, not just the figures but the structure of it, the relationships, the risk. A silence, then Richard's voice, flatter than usual, stripped of its social polish. He never mentioned her. He never mentioned her to anyone outside the work. That was her condition. She was a baron's wife, your grace. The world was not particularly forgiving of women who understood finance better than their husbands. She protected herself the only way she could, by being invisible. Another silence, longer this time. And the girl, Edith, pressed herself slightly back against the wall. Miss Calloway began accompanying her mother to the London offices at 15. By 18 she was doing much of the work herself. Edmund used to say, Harwick paused. He used to say that Margaret had the mind for it, but Edith had the mind and the nerve. He was very fond of her. The holdings. Richard's voice now had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, not anger, not embarrassment, something more complex and less comfortable than either. The Thames leases, the shipping contracts. Legally transferred, witnessed by 3 solicitors and the Countess Marlowe, who was present at the signing as a representative of. I know who she represents. A pause. So technically. Technically, Harwick said, with the careful neutrality of a man who has chosen his words very precisely, you are, with respect to the Ashford commercial holdings in London, operating on Miss Calloway's property. Yes. The silence that followed was the longest yet. Then Harwick again, quieter. There is one more thing, your grace. The sound of paper, an envelope being placed on a surface. She brought this tonight. She intended to give it to you after dinner. I believe she still does if you wish to receive it. What is it? I think you should open it yourself. A pause, the soft sound of paper unfolding. And then nothing, a silence so complete that Edith could hear the candle in the corridor beside her making its small, steady sound against the dark. She knew what he was reading. The servant's menu, her copy, which she had folded and carried in her glove all day, and had sealed into an envelope before dressing for dinner. And beneath it, in her own handwriting, the 11 words she had decided on that morning in the doorway of her cold east wing room, with the kitchen garden outside the warped window and the smell of turnip soup already rising through the walls. I forgive debts more easily than insults. She did not wait to hear his response. She turned and walked back toward the banquet hall, her steps quiet on the stone floor, her hands steady at her sides. Behind her, through the not-quite-closed door, she heard Richard Vane say something too low to make out the words, only the tone of it. The tone of a man who has just understood something important, too late, in an empty room. The banquet ended the way grand evenings sometimes do, not with a single moment but with a gradual unwinding, guests drifting from the table to the drawing room, conversations breaking apart and reforming in smaller configurations, the candles burning lower and the laughter becoming slightly less careful as the port made its rounds. Edith stayed longer than she had planned. The Countess kept her close through the dessert course and the hour that followed, introducing her to people with the particular deliberateness of a woman who understands that visibility, once established, must be reinforced. Lord Fenwick shook her hand with an expression of belated recognition that he was too well-bred to let become embarrassment. Sir Thomas Croft, to his credit, looked her directly in the eye and said he had known her mother slightly, years ago, and that Margaret Calloway had been one of the most impressive women he had ever met. A statement that arrived approximately 15 years too late, but which Edith accepted with perfect grace regardless. She was good at accepting things with grace. She had been practicing for a very long time. Richard Vane did not return to the drawing room for 40 minutes. When he did, he looked like a man who had spent those 40 minutes doing something more difficult than standing in a library. His composure was intact. She would give him that, but it sat differently on him now, slightly less certain of itself, like a coat that had been put back on in a hurry. He moved through the room with his usual authority and said the right things to the right people, and kept his eyes from going to her end of the room with what she suspected was considerable effort. Lady Priscilla noticed immediately. Edith watched her notice, watched the small recalibration behind Priscilla's eyes, the rapid, instinctive assessment of a woman who has built her position on paying attention to exactly this kind of shift in a man's attention. Priscilla crossed the room to Richard's side, with a timing so precise. It was almost architectural, slipping her hand through his arm and redirecting his gaze toward Lord Fenwick with a bright, social question that gave him something to answer and kept him from looking anywhere else. She was very good. Edith acknowledged this without admiration. It was nearly 11 when Edith finally said good night to the Countess and made her way toward the corridor that led to the east wing staircase. She was thinking about the note, about whether he had read it yet. Of course he had read it. Harwick had made sure of that, and what he had made of it, and whether it had landed the way she had intended, which was not as a threat and not as a plea but as something more precise than either. A statement of terms. A small, clear line drawn in careful handwriting. She was almost to the staircase when she heard her name. Not loudly, not the public performing voice he used in rooms full of people. This was different, lower, and with something in it that she hadn't heard from him before. Something that had not been there this morning or yesterday or in any of the 4 days she had spent being looked through in this house. She stopped, turned. He was standing at the end of the corridor, still in his dinner coat, one hand against the wall as though he had come around the corner quickly and stopped himself. He looked, for the first time since she had arrived at Ashford Manor, like a man who did not entirely know what he was going to say next. She waited. She was very good at waiting. "Miss Calloway," he said it again, slightly differently this time, not calling after her now, just saying it as though testing the weight of it. "I would like to." "Your Grace." Priscilla appeared at the other end of the corridor. She had followed him, of course she had followed him, Edith thought. She had been watching him all evening, and she came down the corridor now with the bright, controlled energy of a woman who has decided that a situation requires managing and has appointed herself to manage it. She stopped beside Richard and looked at Edith with a smile that was perfectly shaped and entirely without warmth. "Miss Calloway, what a lovely evening. You must be exhausted, such a long day for you." The implication sat in the air between them, like something that had been placed there deliberately. Edith looked at her. Just looked, with the quiet, level gaze she had developed over years of being in rooms where people said things with their smiles that they would never say aloud. She had learned, a long time ago, that the most unsettling response to this kind of smile was no response at all, just the calm, untroubled attention of a woman who has nothing to hide and nothing to defend. "Not at all," Edith said pleasantly. "Good evening, Lady Priscilla." She turned back to Richard. He was watching Priscilla with an expression that was very difficult to read. She had noticed this about him, that he was good at not showing the thing he was actually feeling, which was a quality she recognized because she shared it. "Good night, Your Grace," she said, and went upstairs. She did not sleep well this time. She lay in the narrow bed in the east wing room and listened to the house settle around her and thought about the corridor, about what he had been going to say. She told herself it didn't matter, that what mattered was the documents, the solicitors, the formal transfer that would happen tomorrow in the presence of the Countess and Lord Harwick and whoever else needed to be present, and that everything else was exactly as peripheral as she had always intended it to be. She almost believed herself. In the morning she came downstairs to find the house quieter, most of the guests having departed or preparing to depart. the entrance hall stripped of its flowers and already returning to its everyday self. She asked for tea and was brought it promptly, which was different from every other morning, and she noted the difference without comment. Lord Harwick found her in the small sitting room at 9:30. He sat down across from her with the unhurried manner of a man who has decided that the time for waiting is over. He looked at her for a moment, with those eyes that missed nothing, and then said, "He wants to speak with you." "I know," said Edith. "Are you going to let him?" She considered this seriously, which she thought he deserved. "After the documents are signed," she said. "Yes." Harwick nodded slowly. "He read your note," he said. "Several times, I think." She looked at her tea. "He is not a bad man," Harwick said, not as a defense, she thought, more as information offered carefully, the way one offers something that might be useful. "He is a man who inherited a great deal very quickly and understood very little of it. Edmund knew that. It was one of the reasons he paused. He wanted to give Richard the chance to learn better. He thought the jolt of it might be useful. The jolt of discovering he'd insulted someone who owns half his income. The jolt of discovering he'd insulted someone who deserved better." Harwick said it simply, without drama. Edmund was always more interested in character than in figures. Edith was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a carriage was being loaded, one of the last guests departing, boxes being strapped to the back with the focused efficiency of a footman who wanted to be done before the weather turned. "He sent me a servant's menu," she said. "Yes. He didn't seat me in the kitchen, but he may as well have done." "Yes. That is not a small thing, Lord Harwick. That is not a misunderstanding or an oversight. That is a man looking at a woman and deciding, deliberately, that she does not deserve to be seen." Harwick was quiet for a moment. Then, "No, it isn't small, and I don't think he believes it is either, not anymore." She looked at him. He met her eyes steadily. "The documents," she said finally, "this afternoon. 2 o'clock. The Countess will be present, and 2 solicitors from London." "Good," she set down her teacup. "Then I will speak with him after." She was in her room, preparing for the 2 o'clock meeting, when she heard it. Voices in the corridor, not loud but not quiet either, the specific register of an argument being conducted by people who do not wish to be overheard and are not quite managing it. She recognized both voices immediately. Priscilla's first, controlled but with something sharp running beneath the surface of it, like a blade wrapped in silk. "You cannot possibly be considering after one evening, after Richard, she is nobody. She was nobody before Edmund lost his senses, and she is nobody now, whatever that document says." And then Richard's voice, which Edith had to lean closer to the door to hear. "That is enough, Priscilla." "It is not enough. I have spent 2 years. I said enough, a silence. Then Priscilla's voice again, lower now, and with something in it that Edith recognized not as cruelty but as desperation, which was, in its own way, worse. "She'll take everything, Richard. The London holdings, the contracts, she'll dismantle everything your family built, and there won't be anything you can do about it. Is that what Edmund wanted? Is that what you want?" "What I want," Richard said very quietly, "is to stop having this conversation." Footsteps, a door closing, then silence. Edith stepped back from her own door. She stood in the middle of her cold East Wing room with the warped window and looked at the kitchen garden outside, which was brown and bare and very still in the November light. She thought, "He said enough." She thought, "That is not nothing." Then she finished buttoning her gloves and went downstairs to sign the documents that would make official what had always, legally, been true. The signing took 40 minutes and required considerably less drama than everything that had preceded it. The 2 solicitors were efficient and unremarkable. The Countess sat to Edith's left and witnessed everything with the focused attention of a woman who takes the formalizing of correct things very seriously. Lord Harwick stood near the window. Richard sat across the table from Edith and signed his portions of the documents with a steady hand, and an expression she couldn't quite read, not resentment, she thought. Something more complicated than resentment. Something that was still becoming itself. When it was done, the solicitors packed their cases and the Countess rose to speak quietly with Harwick near the door, giving the room a different shape, smaller, more private than it had been a moment before. Richard looked at Edith across the table. She looked back. "Miss Calloway," he said, and then stopped. She waited. "I owe you," he stopped again, started differently. "The menu, what was sent to your room, I did not." Another stop. He looked, she thought, like a man who has rehearsed several versions of something and has discovered in the moment that none of them are quite right. "I should like to explain." "You don't need to explain it," Edith said. "I understood it perfectly." He looked at her. "That makes it worse," he said quietly. She considered this. "Yes," she agreed, "it does." A silence. Not an uncomfortable one, exactly. More like the silence of two people standing on opposite sides of something and both looking at it honestly for the first time. "I read your note," he said. "I know." Several times, she said nothing. He reached into his coat and placed it on the table between them. The servant's menu, her copy, still folded along the creases she had made that morning in the doorway. Her 11 words in her own handwriting visible below the printed list of turnip soup and barley bread. "I would like to keep it," he said, "if you'll permit me." She looked at the paper, at the careful fold of it, the slight wear at the edges from being carried in his pocket all day. She looked at his face. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I don't want to forget what it cost," he said. He stopped. "What I didn't understand." From the other side of the room, the Countess was preparing to leave. The rustle of her cape, the quiet word to Harwick, the particular sounds of someone tactfully making an exit. In a moment the room would be different again. Edith looked at the menu on the table between them. "Keep it," she said. Then she stood and smoothed her skirts and walked to say goodbye to the Countess, leaving him sitting at the table with the paper in his hands and something in his expression that had not been there yesterday, or the day before, or on any of the 4 days she had spent being invisible in this house. It was the beginning of something. She was not ready to name it yet. But she thought carefully, privately, without letting it show on her face, that it was not nothing. The letter arrived at Lady Priscilla's family estate in Wiltshire on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the banquet. It was not a long letter. Richard had never been a man who used more words than the situation required, and in this case the situation required very few. The engagement, he wrote, was dissolved. He wished her well. He was sorry for the manner of it, the letter rather than the conversation, which he acknowledged was not what she deserved. But he believed a clean ending was kinder than a prolonged one, and he had always preferred honesty to comfort in himself as much as in others. He did not mention Edith. He didn't need to. Priscilla would understand what had happened and why, and she was a clever enough woman to know that the why had been coming for longer than the banquet, longer perhaps than either of them had been willing to see clearly. They had suited each other on paper, the right families, the right appearances, the right social arithmetic, and paper was not nothing, but it was also not enough, and Richard had spent enough of his life doing things because they made sense on paper. He sealed the letter on a Wednesday evening and sat for a long time in the library afterward, not reading, not working, just sitting in the chair by the fire with the servant's menu on the desk in front of him, and the strange, stripped feeling of a man who has just removed something heavy and is not yet sure what to do with his hands. The next morning he called the household staff together. This was not something the Duke of Ashford typically did. It was not something his father had done, or his uncle, at least not in living memory, and the assembling of them in the entrance hall produced an atmosphere of collective anxiety that Richard recognized and felt mildly guilty about. They came in from the kitchen and the stables and the upper floors, arranging themselves in a loose, uncertain group. their faces arranged in the careful neutrality of people who have learned that being summoned by the Duke rarely means pleasant news. He stood at the top of the entrance hall steps and looked at them. He thought about Edith in the doorway of the East Wing room, the warped window, the view of the kitchen garden, the folded paper. I forgive debts more easily than insults. He cleared his throat. I want to address something that occurred during the banquet, he said. A communication was sent to a guest of this house, to Miss Calloway, that was incorrect. The wrong document was delivered to her room. He watched their faces, saw the particular stillness of people trying very hard not to react. I am making clear, now and for the record, that Miss Calloway holds a formal interest in the Ashford London holdings, and that her status in relation to this estate is that of a principal associate. She is to be received accordingly, at any time, under any circumstances, should she choose to return. A pause. That is all. They dispersed with the quiet efficiency of well-trained staff who have many questions and will ask none of them. Richard went back to the library. He sat down at his desk, picked up the servant's menu, read her 11 words again for what was, he did not count, but it was not a small number the manyth time. Then he pulled out a sheet of paper and picked up his pen, and put it down again, and picked it up. The problem he was discovering was that he did not know how to write this letter. He had written difficult letters before, letters to creditors when his father's debts had first become apparent, letters to tenants during the hard winter of 1811, the letter to Priscilla 3 days ago which had cost him something but had come, in the end, with a kind of clarity. Those letters he had known how to write because he had known what they needed to accomplish. He was good at purposeful language. He was less good at language that had no purpose except to say, I was wrong, and I know it, and I am sorry in a way that I am struggling to make fit into sentences. He had never been required to write that kind of letter before. He had never, if he was honest with himself, and he was trying lately to be more honest with himself, been in a situation that required it. He had moved through his life with the particular ease of a man whose mistakes had always been small enough to step over, or wealthy enough to correct without too much difficulty, or private enough to be no one's business but his own. This was different. This was a woman who had come to his house carrying the legal ownership of half his family's commercial income, and he had sent her a servant's menu, and she had tucked it into her glove and smiled. That smile, which he now understood had not been submission or acceptance but something considerably more dangerous. And she had sat at the wrong end of his table and waited, with extraordinary patience, for the evening to become what it was always going to become. And he had been the last person in the room to understand any of it. He picked up the pen again. He wrote, Dear Miss Calloway. He stared at it, crossed it out, wrote it again. He wrote the letter over 4 days. Not continuously. He had an estate to run, tenants to meet with, the ongoing tedium of the post-banquet correspondence, a conversation with his solicitors about the restructuring of the London holdings that was more complicated and more humbling than he had anticipated. He wrote in the evenings mostly, in the library, with the fire burning low and the rest of the house quiet around him. He did not write what he had originally intended to write, which was an explanation. He had started with the explanation, with Lady Priscilla's role in keeping him ignorant of Edith's connection to the estate, the manipulated information, the deliberate misdirection, and had written 3 pages of it before reading it back and realizing that it sounded, in its careful thoroughness, like a man building himself a defense rather than offering an apology. He crossed all of it out. He started again. He wrote instead what he had actually seen, not what he had been told, not what he now knew what he had seen, and failed to understand and chosen not to examine closely enough. The way he had looked at her across the dinner table on the first evening and looked away. The library, where he had turned pages in a ledger and performed a disinterest he had not entirely felt. The East Wing room with the warped window. The menu. I told myself, he wrote, that I was being efficient, that I was managing a complicated situation with appropriate clarity. I understand now that I was being something considerably simpler than that and considerably less flattering. He paused, looked at the fire. What I mean to say is this. You deserved better from the first moment you arrived in this house, and I knew enough to know it, and I chose not to act on that knowledge. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a choice, and I am sorry for it. He read it back. It wasn't enough, it would never be quite enough, but it was honest, which he had decided was more important than impressive. He kept writing. He wrote about the note, about reading it in the library while Harwick stood by the window and waited, about sitting with those 11 words in a quiet room and understanding, with a clarity that had arrived too late and landed hard, exactly what kind of man he had been in that moment, and exactly what it had cost her to choose grace over retaliation. You could have made things very difficult, he wrote. You had every right to. The fact that you did not is not a debt I am capable of repaying, but I want you to know that I understand it, what it cost, and what it means, and that I will not forget it. He stopped, looked at what he had written, looked at the servant's menu beside his elbow on the desk. He added one more line. I would very much like the opportunity to begin again if you are willing. I recognize that I am not owed that opportunity. I am only asking for it. He signed it, folded it, sealed it. And then he sat for a long time before he gave it to Harwick to send, because he was, for reasons he was only beginning to understand, more afraid of this than he had been of anything in recent memory. The days that followed were the longest he could remember. He worked. He managed. He answered correspondence and reviewed accounts and rode out to the north tenants on a morning when the frost was heavy on the grass, and the sky was the particular pewter gray of an English November that has decided to take itself seriously. He did all the things that a duke with a well-run estate does on ordinary days, and he did them with reasonable competence, and he thought about the letter approximately every 40 minutes. Harwick said nothing. This was one of the things Richard had always appreciated about Harwick, the man's extraordinary capacity for strategic silence. He moved through the house with his usual quiet efficiency, and when Richard caught his eye across rooms, he offered nothing except the mild, patient expression of a man who is willing to wait for as long as is necessary. A week passed, then 10 days. Richard began to understand, slowly and with considerable discomfort, that she might not answer, that she was entirely within her rights not to answer. That 11 words on the back of a servant's menu, however carefully meant, were not a guarantee of anything, were not even perhaps an invitation, and that he had been foolish to read them as one. He rode out to the north tenants again on the 11th day, partly because they required visiting, and partly because the library had begun to feel like a room in which he was doing nothing except waiting, and he had never been good at waiting. He was coming back across the lower field when he saw Harwick at the top of the drive. The old man was standing very still in the cold afternoon light, watching him approach with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one, the look of a man who knows something, and has decided that the knowing of it is a pleasure he is going to allow himself for approximately 30 more seconds before sharing it. Richard pulled up his horse. Harwick reached into his coat and produced an envelope. It was cream-colored. The handwriting on the front was small and precise and entirely steady. Richard looked at it for a long moment without taking it. "When did it arrive?" he said. "This morning," said Harwick. "I thought you might prefer to read it somewhere other than the entrance hall." Richard took the envelope. He turned it over in his hands. The seal on the back was plain, no family crest, just a simple pressed circle, and he thought, looking at it, about a woman who had spent years being invisible by choice and was only just beginning, perhaps, to decide whether she wanted to be seen. He broke the seal. The letter was not long. It was, in fact, considerably shorter than his had been, 3 paragraphs, the same small, precise handwriting, utterly without decoration or excess. She had received his letter. She had read it. She believed him, not entirely, not yet, because trust was a thing that had to be built rather than declared, and she had learned this the hard way, and she did not apologize for knowing it. But she was willing. That was what the second paragraph said. Simply, directly, without softening or complication, I am willing. The third paragraph was the shortest, only 2 sentences. I will be in London next month at the Ashford offices, for the first of what I expect will be several very long meetings with your solicitors. If you wish to begin again, Your Grace, I suggest you be there. I will know if you are not. Richard read it twice. Then he folded it carefully along her own creases, so as not to add new ones, and put it in his coat pocket against his chest. He looked at Harwick. Harwick looked back at him with the expression of a man who has been waiting 11 years for things to start going the right way, and is quietly pleased that they appear, at last, to be doing so. "I'll need to go to London," Richard said. "Yes," said Harwick, "I imagined you would." London in December was a different creature, entirely from the London of summer. It arrived early in the mornings as a grey wall of cold coming off the Thames, pressing itself against the windows of the buildings along the waterfront, and sitting there all day with the patient determination of something that intends to stay. The streets were darker earlier, the gas lamps coming on before 4 o'clock, their light falling in soft yellow circles on the wet cobblestones below. The river smelled of coal smoke and iron, and the particular cold dampness that belongs only to large bodies of water in winter, and the men who worked along it moved quickly and kept their heads down and did not look at the sky. Richard had forgotten how much he disliked London in December. He had arrived 3 days before the scheduled meeting, not because there was business that required him 3 days early, though he had manufactured some, but because he had not trusted himself to arrive on the correct day and walk into that building with any semblance of composure if he had spent the preceding 48 hours sitting in his townhouse thinking about it. Movement helped, having somewhere to be helped. And so he had meetings with his bank on the first day, and a conversation with his tailor that he had been postponing for 6 months on the second, and on the third day he ran out of things to manufacture and walked along the embankment for 2 hours in the cold and thought about her letter. "I will know if you are not." He had no doubt that she would. The Ashford London offices occupied the upper 2 floors of a solid Georgian building on a quiet street 3 blocks from the river, the kind of building that does not announce itself, that simply exists with the quiet confidence of something that has been where it is for a long time and expects to remain there. Richard had visited it twice before, both times briefly, both times with the distracted attention of a man moving through an obligation rather than paying it proper notice. He noticed it now. He stood on the pavement outside at 10 minutes to 9 on the morning of the meeting, and looked at it the way he imagined Edith looked at things, carefully, with the particular attention of someone who understands that details matter and has learned not to rush past them. The brass plate beside the door read, "Ashford Commercial Holdings Est, 1798. Below it newer, the engraving slightly sharper, E. Calloway, Principal Associate." He had not seen that before. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he went inside. The offices were already occupied when he arrived. 2 solicitors from his own firm, Pierce and a younger man whose name Richard could never quite retain, were arranging papers at the long table in the main meeting room. A clerk moved between the filing cabinets with the focused efficiency of someone who has been here since 7 and intends everyone to know it. A fire had been lit in the grate, and the room was warm, smelling of paper and wood smoke, and the particular dusty comfort of a space where serious work has been done for a long time. Richard's solicitor looked up when he entered and began explaining something about the restructuring of the lease agreements, a conversation Richard participated in with sufficient competence to disguise the fact that approximately half of his attention was on the door. At 9 o'clock exactly, it opened. Edith came in without ceremony, no announcement, no pause in the doorway, just the quiet, purposeful entry of a woman who knows where she is going and sees no reason to perform the knowing of it. She wore dark gray, simply cut, and her hair was done differently than it had been at the banquet, more practically, less formally, the hair of a woman who has a long day of work ahead of her and has dressed accordingly. She carried a leather folder under one arm and had the focused, settled expression of someone who has already read everything in that folder at least twice. She looked at the room, at the solicitors, at the clerk, at Richard. Her expression did not change in any dramatic way, but something in it shifted very slightly in the eyes, and he thought, "She wasn't certain I would come." The realization settled in him quietly, without triumph, because there was nothing triumphant about it. She had written, "I will know if you are not," with all the composure of a woman who expected to be disappointed, who had been disappointed before, and who had decided to give him the chance regardless. He had come, that was all. It was not heroic, it was the minimum. But she saw it, and he saw her see it, and something shifted between them that had nothing to do with the solicitors or the lease agreements or the restructuring of the Thames contracts. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Calloway," he said. And they sat down on opposite sides of the table and began to work. It was, as she had predicted, a very long meeting. The lease agreements alone took 2 hours, 3 properties along the river, their terms overlapping in ways that required careful untangling, the language of the original contracts dating back to Edmund's time and written, in the particular dense opacity that solicitors of that era had apparently considered a form of art. Edith moved through it with a fluency that Richard found, by the end of the first hour, genuinely startling. She did not consult her folder constantly, she had it, and she referred to it, but mostly she spoke from memory, from understanding, from the kind of deep familiarity with a subject that only comes from years of serious attention. She caught an error in the third lease agreement that Pierce had missed entirely. She did it without fanfare. A quiet "I believe this figure should read 1400, not 400, and slid the document across to him with one finger pointing at the relevant line. Pierce looked at it, checked his notes, and went slightly pink. "Quite right, Miss Calloway, my apologies." "Not at all," she said and moved on. Richard watched her. He tried not to do it obviously. He had documents of his own that required attention, and he was not a man who stared, but he watched her in the way you watch something you have drastically misjudged and are only now beginning to see correctly. The steadiness of her, the precision. The way she listened to the solicitors without deference, but also without arrogance. Just the calm, level attention of someone who respects competence and expects it in return, and will tell you quietly when it falls short. He thought about the library at Ashford, the turned pages, the performed disinterest. He thought about what Harwick had said. Edmund used to say she had the mind and the nerve. He thought, yes, obviously, how did I not see it? They broke at 12:30. The solicitors went a fine lunch. The clerk disappeared. The fire burned steadily in the grate, and the room was quiet for the first time all morning, just the sound of the river outside the windows and the distant movement of the street below. Edith was making a note in her folder. Richard poured 2 glasses of water from the carafe on the sideboard and set one beside her without asking. She glanced at it, then at him, then went back to her note. He sat down, not across the table this time, but one seat closer than that, which was still a respectable distance, and which he hoped communicated something without requiring him to say it aloud, because he was not yet certain he had the right language for what he wanted to say. "You were here before," he said, "at these offices when you were younger." She looked up. "Yes." "With your mother?" "Yes," she paused. "From the time I was 15, though for the first 2 years my primary role was to sit in the corner and read and not interrupt." "When did that change?" Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, but related to one. When Edmund caught me correcting a shipping manifest in the margins of the document he'd asked me to hold, she said. He took it from me, read my corrections, and then told me to sit at the table. After that, I sat at the table. Richard was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table, long, solid, the wood worn slightly at the edges from years of use, the kind of surface that has had a great many serious conversations conducted across it and carries the memory of them in its grain. He never told me, he said, any of it about your mother, about you, about what was in the will. I know. I want you to understand, not as an excuse. I am not making excuses, but I want you to understand that I was not. That you were not deliberately cruel, she said. That you simply did not know what you did not know. Yes. She considered this with the serious, unhurried attention she gave everything. I believe you, she said. That is not the same as saying it didn't matter, but yes, I believe you. He looked at her. She was looking at the table, at her folder, at the papers spread across it, and he thought about the East Wing room and the warped window, and what it had cost her to come to this house at all, knowing what she knew, carrying what she carried, and to do it with that particular composure that was not coldness and not indifference but something much harder than either. Why did you come? He said. To Ashford. You could have had the solicitors handle it. You didn't have to be there in person. She was quiet for a moment. Edmund asked me to, she said. In a letter he left with Harwick, he said, she stopped, started again. He said that the estate needed to understand what it had, and that the only way for it to understand was to see. He meant me. He meant the estate, she said carefully. I think he was being diplomatic. Richard looked at the fire. He always was, he said, more than I gave him credit for. A pause. Outside, a cart moved along the street below, its wheels loud on the wet stones, and then the sound faded and the room was quiet again. Miss Calloway, he said. She looked at him. I meant what I wrote, about beginning again. He kept his voice level not because he didn't feel it, but because she was a woman who responded to steadiness. He was learning to the honest and the direct rather than the performed. I am not asking for more than that, only the chance. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire shifted in the grate. Somewhere in the building below, a door closed. You are already in the room, Your Grace, she said quietly. That is a beginning. It was not an embrace, and it was not a declaration, and it was not the resolution of anything, not yet. But it was said in a voice that meant something, and he heard what it meant, and he did not push for more than that because he was beginning, slowly and with some difficulty but genuinely, to understand what patience looked like when it was chosen rather than endured. The solicitors returned at 1 o'clock. They went back to work. By 4 o'clock the lease agreements were settled. The shipping contracts were restructured to the satisfaction of both parties, and the import licenses had been reviewed, annotated, and signed in all the places that required signatures. Pierce gathered his papers with the relieved efficiency of a man who has had a more demanding morning than he anticipated, and is looking forward to a quiet evening. The younger solicitor said something about a cab. The clerk extinguished the extra lamps. Edith was closing her folder when Richard said, I am told there is a reasonable restaurant 2 streets from here, if you have not yet made arrangements for dinner. She looked up. He met her eyes. It is only dinner, he said, and it is cold outside and you have been working since 9 o'clock. She looked at him for a moment with that level, considering gaze that he was beginning to find he could read slightly better than he could at the banquet. Not well, not yet, but better. He could see the calculation in it, and also, beneath the calculation, something that was not quite reluctance. 2 streets, she said. 2 streets, he confirmed. She picked up her folder. Then I suppose, she said, you had better lead the way, since it is your city. It's your city too, he said. Your offices are in it. Something crossed her face then, quick and warm and entirely unguarded, gone almost before it arrived. But he saw it. He was paying attention now, properly. the way he should have been from the beginning, and he saw it. They walked out into the December evening together, the gas lamps already burning gold against the dark, the river cold and present 2 streets away, the city moving around them with its usual magnificent indifference to the small, significant things happening within it. She did not take his arm. He did not offer it. But they walked at the same pace, close enough that their steps matched on the wet cobblestones, and neither of them moved away. Spring came to London the way it always does, not all at once, but in small, accumulating arguments against the cold. First the light, arriving a few minutes earlier each morning and staying a few minutes later each evening, as though testing whether it was welcome. Then the trees along the embankment, cautiously green at the tips, feeling out the warmth before committing to it. Then the smell of the city changing, the coal smoke still there. It was always there. But underneath it something softer arriving, something that had been away for months and had come back without announcing itself. Edith noticed all of it from the window of the Ashford offices, where she had been spending 3 days a week since January. It had begun as a practical arrangement. The restructured contracts required oversight, the lease agreements needed managing through their first quarter under the new terms, and there was enough work to justify the presence of someone who understood the full architecture of it. That was the language they had used, she and Richard and the solicitors, in the careful, professional conversation of people who are being sensible. Practical arrangement, oversight, justified presence. She had not minded the language. It was accurate as far as it went. What it did not account for was the Tuesday afternoons. It had started in January, unremarkably. Richard had been in London on a state business and had come to the offices at 3:30 with a question about one of the import licenses that could, she noted, have been put in a letter. She had answered it. He had sat down. She had offered tea because it was cold and because it would have been strange not to. They had talked first about the license, and then about other things, with the natural drift of a conversation between two people who are discovering that they have more to say to each other than the official business requires. He had stayed until 5. The following Tuesday he had appeared again at the same time, with another question that could have been a letter. She had not said this. She had answered the question and offered tea, and they had talked until 5:30. And when he left, she had sat for a moment in the quiet office with her hands around her teacup and looked at the river through the window and thought, "This is becoming something." She was not afraid of it. That surprised her a little. She had expected to be more cautious than she was. She had earned her caution, had built it carefully over years of watching what happened when women of her position trusted the wrong things. But there was something about Richard that made the caution feel less necessary than she had anticipated. Not because he was charming. He wasn't particularly, not in the way of men who have learned to use charm as a tool. He was direct and occasionally awkward and sometimes said the wrong thing and corrected himself with a seriousness that she found, against her better instincts, rather endearing. He was learning, she could see that, watch it happening. The slow and genuine work of a man who has understood something about himself that he doesn't like and is doing something about it rather than simply feeling badly. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, a great deal. By March, the Tuesday afternoons had become an understood thing, unspoken and unscheduled but reliable, the kind of reliability that accumulates without being announced and is more convincing for it. The letter about the banquet arrived on a Wednesday in early April. It came this time on the heavy cream stationery, the kind stamped with the Duke's seal in midnight blue wax, the kind that smelled faintly of cedar and importance. Edith recognized it immediately and held it for a moment before opening it, aware of the small, deliberate symmetry of this, the first envelope, the wrong paper, the turnip soup, and what it meant that this one was different. She opened it at her desk, alone, in the early morning before the clerks arrived. Inside was a formal invitation to a dinner at Ashford Manor on the first Saturday of May. Not a royal banquet this time, smaller, 30 guests, an occasion described in the invitation as a celebration of the formal completion of the Ashford London restructuring. Her name was at the top of the guest list, as it had always, legally, belonged. Below the formal invitation, in handwriting she recognized now as well as her own, a separate note, short, as his notes tended to be. The East Wing room has been repainted. The window has been repaired. I recognize this does not begin to cover it. It is a start. R. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at the river for a long moment. Then she wrote back, I will be there. She arrived at Ashford Manor on a Friday afternoon, the day before the dinner, in the golden early evening light of a May that had decided to be generous. The drive looked different in spring, the trees fully green now, the formal gardens to the east in early bloom, the gravel newly raked, and the stone of the house warm in the late sun. A footman she didn't recognize came down the steps to meet her carriage. Behind him, at the top of the steps, Richard. Not his secretary, not Harwick. Richard himself in his shirt sleeves as though he had been working and had come out without thinking about it, which she suspected was exactly what had happened. She stepped down from the carriage and looked at him at the top of the steps, and he looked back at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because sometimes the gap between the last time you saw someone and the present moment is wide enough that words need a second to catch up. Then, you came, he said. I said I would, she said. I know, a pause, I am glad of it. She walked up the steps. He held the door. She went inside. The East Wing room was, as promised, repainted. Soft white, warmer than the previous gray, and the warped window had been replaced entirely. The new glass clear and perfectly fitted, letting in the evening light without resistance. Someone had put flowers on the small table by the window. Not the elaborate arrangements of the banquet, just a simple bunch of early garden roses, pink and slightly uneven, the kind that are cut from an actual garden rather than ordered from a florist. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. Behind her, in the corridor, the room beside it is also available if you'd prefer more space, and there are rooms in the south wing that are considerably larger if. This one is fine, she said. A pause. You're certain? I am certain. She turned to look at him. He was standing in the corridor with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and was not entirely succeeding. It is a good room, she said. It always was. It only needed the window. He looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said quietly, I think that's right. She thought, he is not talking about the room. She thought, neither am I. The dinner was everything the November banquet had not been. 30 guests, well-chosen people who knew the Ashford holdings and the work that had gone into the restructuring, people who understood what was being celebrated, people who would not need the significance explained to them. The table was round, Richard's doing, she suspected, which made the geometry of precedence irrelevant and the conversation circular and warm. The food was excellent. The wine was better. Edith sat to Richard's right. Not because she had been placed there by a secretary, not because a place card had been arranged in advance, because Richard had held the chair himself, in full view of 30 people, with the simple deliberateness of a man making something clear that does not require announcement but will be noted and understood. She sat. She looked at the table, the candles burning evenly, the spring flowers in the low arrangements, the faces of people talking and laughing in the uncomplicated way of a good evening, and she thought about November, about the last seat, the kitchen door, the folded paper inside her glove. She thought, look how far we are from that room. Harwick caught her eye from across the table and lifted his glass slightly. She returned the gesture with a composure that cost her nothing because she was, for the first time in a very long time, not holding anything back. After dinner, when the guests had moved to the drawing room and the table had been cleared and the candles were burning lower, Richard found her in the portrait gallery. She had come here on purpose. She had wanted to see it, the long room with its rows of vain family faces looking out from their gilded frames, the accumulation of generations that she had not properly looked at on her first visit. She stood in front of a portrait near the center of the row, an older man, painted in middle age, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an expression of contained amusement that she recognized immediately. Edmund, younger than she had known him, but unmistakably himself. She heard Richard's steps behind her and did not turn. He came to stand beside her. They looked at the portrait together for a moment. "He looks like he knew something," Richard said. "He always did," she said. "That was the thing about him. He never told you what it was. He just arranged things so that you would find out." "He arranged us," Richard said. It was not a question. She considered it anyway, seriously, the way she considered everything. "He created the conditions," she said. "What we did with them was our own." Richard was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at her rather than the portrait, and she let him, because she was tired of being looked through and had decided, sometime in the last few months, that being looked at properly with attention was something she could permit herself. "Miss Calloway," he said. She turned. He was closer than she had realized, not improperly so, but close enough that she could see the expression on his face clearly. And what was on his face was the thing she had watched arriving slowly over the past months, through Tuesday afternoons and December dinners and letters across the distance between London and Ashford, through the gradual, patient accumulation of a man learning to see what had always been in front of him. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. She recognized it, cream, cedar, the midnight blue seal. She took it, opened it. Inside, a single card, handwritten, in the careful formal script of something that has been written and rewritten until it is exactly right. At the top, in small, elegant letters, "For Miss Edith Calloway, guest of honor. Always." Below that, the menu for the evening's dinner, not the food they had just eaten, but something else. Something she didn't understand immediately, and then did. Every dish was one she had mentioned in passing over the past months. The almond cake she had said her mother used to make. The particular soup she had described from a dinner in Bath years ago. The strawberries, she had said, were the only thing that made June in London worthwhile. Small things, said without weight in the middle of other conversations. She had not known he was listening so carefully. She looked up from the card. "I have been paying attention," he said simply. "I know I was slow to start, but I have been paying attention." She looked at him, at the card, at Edmund's portrait over his shoulder with its contained amusement that she now thought might, in fact, be satisfaction. "There is something else," Richard said. At the bottom, she looked down. Below the menu in smaller writing, a single line. "I would like to discuss a permanent arrangement if you are willing." The gallery was very quiet. Somewhere at the other end of the house, the distant sound of conversation and music, the evening continuing without them, content to do so. Edith looked at the card for a long moment. She thought about Bath and the narrow rooms above the bookshop. She thought about the east wing and the warped window and the folded paper in her glove. She thought about December and the offices and the Tuesday afternoons and the way his steps had matched hers on the wet cobblestones in the dark. She looked up. "That," she said, "is a very formal way of asking something." Something shifted in his face, the composed surface of it giving way to something warmer and considerably less certain of itself. Something that she thought was probably as close as Richard Vane was capable of coming to nervousness. "I am a formal man," he said, "when it matters." "It matters," she said. "I know." A pause. The candles in the gallery burned steadily. Edmund looked on. "Ask me properly," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he took the card gently from her hands, turned it over, and held it out to her with a pen that he had produced from somewhere. She had no idea where. She suspected he had been carrying it all evening in case of exactly this. And she understood that he intended her to write the answer herself, in her own words, on her own terms. She looked at him, at the pen, at the blank back of the card. She took the pen. She wrote 2 words. She turned the card so he could read them. I am. 1 year later, the portrait gallery at Ashford Manor had a new addition at the far end, hung in the best light, in a frame chosen with some care, positioned so that it was the first thing you saw when you entered from the main hall rather than the last. It was a portrait of 2 people. Richard stood on the left, in the dark coat he had worn to the spring dinner, with the expression of a man who is precisely where he intends to be and knows it. Beside him, Edith, the Duchess of Ashford, as of 6 months prior, in a ceremony attended by 30 guests and one very satisfied Lord Harwick and one Countess Marlowe who had worn the finest thing in her wardrobe and cried twice, and denied it both times. Edith had chosen what she wore for the portrait herself, not the ivory silk of a woman performing the role of Duchess. Something simpler, darker, more precisely herself. The kind of dress a woman wears when she is not dressing for anyone but her own sense of what is right. The painter had captured her expression well, that particular quality of hers, the stillness that was not coldness, the composure that was not distance, the intelligence in the eyes that had always been there for anyone willing to look. Visitors to Ashford Manor stopped in front of it. They always stopped in front of it. There was something about it that invited looking, that rewarded attention. Partly the quality of the painting, partly the way the 2 figures stood, not performing togetherness but simply in it, the ease of people who have arrived somewhere after some difficulty and are not in any hurry to leave. But mostly, people stopped because of the small thing on the table in the lower left corner of the portrait. Half in shadow, easy to miss if you weren't looking closely. A piece of paper, folded, slightly worn at the edges. Beside it, a small framed card too small to read in the painting, but present, deliberate, clearly placed there by someone who wanted it there. Visitors who knew the house well enough to ask were told about it by the housekeeper, Mrs. Poole, who had been at Ashford for 30 years and had a gift for the precise and well-timed story. She told it without embellishment because it didn't need any. The servant's menu, the banquet, the note in 11 words, the long way back from that moment to this one. Guests listened. Some smiled. Some shook their heads slowly in the manner of people encountering a thing that is both unlikely and, on reflection, inevitable. One afternoon in late October, almost exactly 2 years after the first banquet, a young woman on a tour of the house stopped in front of the portrait for a long time. She was perhaps 19, the daughter of a minor family, with the careful, watchful eyes of someone who has spent a good deal of her life being looked through. She stared at Edith's painted face for quite a while. Then she turned to Mrs. Poole and asked, quietly, about the folded paper in the corner of the frame. Mrs. Poole told her. The young woman listened without speaking. When the story was finished, she turned back to the portrait one more time and looked at it with an expression that was complicated and private and not Mrs. Poole's business to interpret. Then she straightened her shoulders and walked on through the gallery with a step that was, Mrs. Poole thought, slightly steadier than it had been when she came in. Downstairs, in the small sitting room at the end of the east wing corridor, the one with the south-facing window and the good light and the view of the garden, which was still beautiful even in late October when most of the color had gone. Edith sat at her desk with a cup of tea at her elbow and a ledger open in front of her, and the quiet, settled focus of a woman doing work she is good at in a place she has chosen to be. On the windowsill in a small standing frame, the servant's menu, its edges soft now with handling, her 11 words visible at the bottom in her own handwriting. And below the frame, propped against the glass, the card from the portrait gallery dinner. Cream, cedar-scented, slightly worn, 2 words on the back in her hand. I am. She had left it there on purpose, where she could see it every day. Not as a reminder of what had been difficult, she had no interest in preserving difficulty, but as a reminder of what she had known, even then, standing in the doorway of this room with the warped window and the cold coming in. That something was coming, that she could wait, that she was worth waiting for. Outside the window, the garden was still and gold and very quiet, the last roses of the season nodding slightly in a wind too gentle to feel. The house moved around her with its ordinary afternoon sounds, a door somewhere, a voice, the distant steps of someone crossing the hall below, her house. She picked up her pen and went back to work. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. If you enjoyed the story, please leave a like and subscribe so you won't miss new stories.